Appendix G continued of Principles of Economics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Principles of Economics by Alfred MARSHALL. Appendix G continued. Paragraph 6. Land near to a growing town, which is still used for agriculture, may yield very little net rent and yet be a valuable property. For its future, ground rents are anticipated in its capital value, and further its ownership is likely to yield an income of satisfaction outside of the money rent received for it. In this case, it is apt to be underassessed even when rated at its full rental value, and the question arises whether it should not be assessed at a percentage on its capital value instead of at a percentage on its rent. Such a plan would hasten on building and thus tend to glut the market for buildings. Therefore, rents would tend to fall and builders would be unable to take building leases on high ground rents. The change would therefore transfer to the people at large some part of the public value of land, which now goes to owners of land that is built upon or is likely to be built upon. But unless accompanied by energetic action on the part of urban authorities in planning out the lines on which towns should grow, it would result in hasty and inappropriate building, a mistake for which coming generations would pay a high price in the loss of beauty and perhaps of health. The principle which lies at the base of this scheme is capable of larger application, and something may be said as to one suggestion of an extreme character, which has recently attracted some attention, to the effect that in future rates should be assessed mainly or even wholly on site values with little or no reference to the value of the buildings. Its immediate effect would be an addition to the value of some properties at the expense of others. In particular, it would raise the value of high and expensive buildings in districts in which the rates were heavy, even more than those in which they were low, because it would afford relief from a greater burden. But it would lower the value of low obsolete buildings on large sites in heavily rated districts. After a time, the amount of building put upon a site would vary generally, subject to the bylaws, with its advantages of situation, instead of as now, partly in proportion to these advantages, and partly inversely as the rates. This would increase concentration and tend to raise gross site values in advantageous districts, but it would also increase the aggregate expenditure from the rates, and as this would fall on site values, the net site values might be very low. Whether on the whole the concentration of population would be increased, it is difficult to say, for the most active building would probably be in the suburbs, where vacant land no longer escaped heavy rating. Much would depend on the building bylaws. The concentration might be much lessened by a rigorous rule that there should be a large free space at the back as well as in front of all high buildings. Note 70. Paragraph 7. Reference has already been made to the latent partnership between tenant and landlord in British agriculture generally. Note 71. Competition is less effective in rural than in urban districts. But on the other hand, the contributions which the landlord makes to the effective capital of the firm are elastic and liable to variation according to the stress of circumstances. These adjustments obscure the incidence of agricultural rates, as the eddies of wind rushing past a house will often carry snowflakes upwards, overbearing but not destroying, the tendency of gravitation. And hence arises the common saying that the farmer will pay both his and the landlord's share of new rates if the competition for farms is strong, while the landlord will pay all if he has reason to fear that farms will be thrown on his hands. However, rural populations probably bear less onerous rates than is commonly supposed. They have gained by improved police service and the abolition of turnpikes, and they have increasing access to advantages purchased by rates in the neighboring towns to which they do not contribute, and which are generally much higher than their own rates. Insofar as the rates are remunerative in the immediate present, they are no net burden to the occupier, though he pays them. But rates are a considerable percentage on the farmer's net income, and the burden on him is apt to be heavy in those very rare cases in which onerous rural rates are increased greatly. As already indicated, an onerous rate confined to one district is likely to press more heavily on the local landlords and farmers than if general throughout the country. Note 72. Paragraph 8. This volume is mainly occupied with scientific enquiries, but yet not without some glances at the practical issues which supply a motive to economic studies. Note 73. And here, some consideration of policy seems desirable in regard to rates. For all economists are agreed that land in an old country resembles other forms of wealth in many respects, and that it differs in others. And in some recent controversial writings, there has appeared a tendency to relegate the points of difference to a secondary place, and to give almost exclusive prominence to those of similarity. A moderate tendency in that direction might be judicious, if the points of similarity alone were of high importance in urgent practical issues. But the contrary is the fact, and therefore it may be well to consider some great issues of administrative finance, in which a leading part is played by those attributes of land which are not largely shared by other forms of wealth. But first, a little must be said as to equity. When a special tax is levied for a particular purpose, and the case is not one for any interference by public authority with existing rights of ownership, as for instance, when an arterial system of land drainage is created, the owners of the properties to be benefited may fitly be assessed on the joint stock principle, according to which calls are made from shareholders in proportion to their stake in the common venture. The equity of every such charge must be judged separately. But on the other hand, all onerous taxes and rates must be judged in equity as a whole. Almost every onerous tax, taken by itself, presses with undue weight on some class or other. But this is of no moment so long as the inequalities of each are compensated by those of others, and variations in the several parts synchronize. If that difficult condition is satisfied, the system may be equitable, though any one part of it regarded alone would be inequitable. Secondly, there is a general agreement that a system of taxation should be adjusted in more or less steep gradation to people's incomes, or better still, to their expenditures. For that part of a man's income which he saves contributes again to the exchequer until it is consumed by expenditure. Consequently, when considering the fact that our present system of taxation, general and local, bears heavily on houses, it should be remembered that large expenditure generally requires large house room, and that while taxes, and especially graduated taxes on expenditure in general, present great technical difficulties to the tax collector and further cost much more to the consumer directly and indirectly than they bring into the revenue. Taxes on houses are technically simple, cheap in collection, not liable to evasion, and easy of graduation. Note 74. But thirdly, this argument does not apply to buildings other than houses, and for that reason, it may be equitable to tax shops, warehouses, factories, etc. on a lower scale than houses, at all events, as far as new rates are concerned. The burdens of old rates is already shifted from the occupiers of business premises, partly on to their landlords and partly on to their customers. This process of shifting is constantly going on, and therefore no great hardship would be inflicted on the trading classes in urban districts if they were charged at once with a farthing for every penny of new rates, while a part or the whole of the remaining 3 farthings were left to be added to their burden gradually by small annual percentages. It may be that some such plan will be necessary if the expenses of urban local government continue to increase fast. These considerations lead us to repeat that, whether in an old or a new country, a far-seeing statesman will feel a greater responsibility to future generations when legislating as to land than as to other forms of wealth, and that from the economic and from the ethical point of view, land must everywhere and always be classed as a thing by itself. If from the first the state had retained true rents in its own hands, the vigor of industry and accumulation need not have been impaired, though in a very few cases the settlement of new countries might have been delayed a little. Nothing at all like this can be said of the incomes derived from property made by man. But the very greatness of the public interests concerned makes it specially necessary to bear in mind when discussing the equities of the public value of land that a sudden appropriation by the state of any incomes from property, the private ownership of which had once been recognized by it, would destroy security and shake the foundations of society. Sudden and extreme measures would be inequitable, and partly, but not solely for that reason, they would be unbusinesslike and even foolish. Caution is necessary, but the curse of high side values is that concentration of population, which is threatening a scarcity of fresh air and light and playroom so grievous as to lower the vigor and the joyousness of the rising generation. Thus, rich private gains accrue, not merely through causes which are public rather than private in their character, but also at the expense of one of the chief forms of public wealth. Large expenditure is needed to secure air and light and playroom, and the most appropriate source from which that expense can be defrayed seems to be those extreme rights of private property in land, which have grown up almost imperceptibly from the time when the king, representing the state, was the sole landowner. Private persons were but landholders, subject to the obligation to work for the public well-being. They have no equitable right to mar that well-being by congested building. Paragraph 9. Accordingly, the following practical suggestions seem to emerge. As regards old rates, a sudden change in the person from whom they are collected seems unadvisable, but additional rates should, as far as may be convenient, be collected from the person on whom they are ultimately to fall, unless, like the income tax under Schedule A, they are collected from the tenant with the instruction that they are to be deducted from his rent. The reasons for this are that nearly the whole of that part of old rates, which is accessed on public or side value of land, is already borne by owners, including lessees, so far as those rates go, which, though old, were not anticipated when their leases were taken. And nearly all the remainder of it is borne by tenants or their customers. This result would not be very greatly disturbed by allowing the tenant to deduct a half or even the whole of his rates from his rent, though such a law would run some risk of handing over some of the property of the owners to lessees who had reckoned for paying those old rates when taking their leases. On the other hand, a provision for the division of new, that is, additional rates, would have great advantages. The occupier, whether of a firm or business premises or a house, would deduct 1/2 of the new rates from his rent. His immediate landlord would deduct in proportion from his payments to the superior holder next to him, and so on. And in addition, new local taxes on business premises of all kinds might be assessed, as has just been suggested, at less than full rates in the first instance, and gradually increased. By these provisions, farmers, shopkeepers, and other traders would be relieved from the occasional injustice and the constant fear of injustice, which are now associated with sudden, disproportionate additions to the public burdens thrown upon particular classes. In regard to site values, it would seem well to rule that all land, whether technically urban or not, should be regarded as having a special site value if, when cleared of buildings, it could be sold at even a moderately high price, say 200 units an acre. It might then be subjected to a general rate assessed on its capital value, and in addition to a fresh air rate to be spent by local authority under full central control for the purposes indicated above. This fresh air rate would not be a very heavy burden on owners, for a good deal of it would be returned to them in the form of higher values for those building sites which remained. As it is, the expenditure of such private societies as the Metropolitan Public Gardens Association and much of the rates raised on building values for public improvements is really a free gift of wealth to owners who are already fortunate. For rural and urban districts alike, after reckoning for the initial rates on land, the remainder of the necessary funds would perhaps best be obtained by rates on immovable property, supplemented by some minor local taxes at the discretion of the local authorities. The inhabited house duty might be suppressed unless it was needed for any great new expenditure, such as old age pensions, and the main rates might be graduated as the present inhabited house duty is, but more gently for houses of moderate size and more severely for very large houses. But no one should be exempted altogether, for so long as a person retains the right of voting on the levying and expenditure of rates, it is not safe that he should wholly escape their pressure. It may, however, be safe and reasonable to return to him or his children the equivalent of his payments in such benefits as will increase physical and mental health and vigor, and will not tend towards political corruption. Note 75. Notes for Marshall, Principles of Economics, Appendix G. Note 64. See pages 453 and 659. Note 65. Above, Chapter 5, Section 9, Paragraph 1. This appendix is largely based on the memorandum there mentioned. Note 66. Final Report of Royal Commission on Local Taxation, 1901, page 12. Note 67. A good deal of evidence on these points was taken by the commission just named, page 794. Note 68. See above, Chapter 5, Section 11, Paragraphs 3 and 8. The builder generally looks to sell his lease before much of it has run out, but the price which he expects to get is the discounted excess of the rental value of the property over the ground rent for the remaining years, and therefore the substance of his calculations is nearly the same as it would be if he intended to keep the property in his own hands. Note 69. This assumes that the land is assessed to the tax at the same amount, whatever the use to which it is put. The case of an extra tax for a special use can be treated as in Chapter 5, Section 10, Paragraph 6. If agricultural land were exempt from the tax, then the tenant of a house or factory in the country would escape that part of the site tax which is assessed on the excess of the value of the land for building uses over its value for agriculture. This might slightly increase concentration in towns and thus take a little from the burden on site owners in them, but it would not materially affect the values of sites in the center of towns. See also below. Note 70. For instance, suppose an area of 1,000,000 square feet to be covered with rows of parallel buildings 40 feet high and 40 feet deep. A bylaw that the sky must subtend half a right angle to the ground, looking straight back as well as front, will cause the distance between each row and the next to be 40 feet, and the aggregate volume of building will be 40 feet multiplied into half the total area, that is 20 million cubic feet. Now suppose the height of the buildings to be trebled. Under the same bylaw, the distances between the rows must be 120 feet, and on the supposition that it is not convenient to increase the depth of the houses beyond 40 feet, the aggregate volume of building will be 120 feet multiplied into a quarter of the total area, that is 30 million cubic feet. Thus, the total accommodation will be increased by only 1/2 instead of being trebled, as would have been the case if the old distances of 40 feet between the rows had been maintained. Note 71. See Chapter 6, Section 10, Paragraph 10. Note 72. See above, page 437. Note 73. See Chapter 1, Section 4, Paragraphs 2 to 4. Note 74. In old times, the windows of a house were taken as representative of the house and were taxed heavily. But the tax did not strike, and was not intended to strike, persons as owners and users of windows only. It was intended to strike them, and did strike them, as owners and users of houses. And just as the window is a more or less good representative of the house, so the house is a representative, perhaps a better representative, of a certain scale and style of household expenditure in general. And when houses are taxed, the tax is, and is intended to be, a tax upon the ownership and use of the means of living in certain general conditions of comfort and social position. If part of the tax assessed on houses were removed, and the deficit made up by taxes assessed on furniture and indoor servants, the true incidence of the taxes would be nearly the same as now. Note 75. The recent Commission on Local Taxation was much occupied with the difficulty of assessing site values, and with the even greater difficulty of making ad interim arrangements by which an equitable share (parenthesis opened), whether more or less (parenthesis closes), of the rates, which were designed in the long run to be paid by the ultimate landowners, might be transferred from the occupiers to lessees (parenthesis open). See especially page 153 to 176 of the final report. Parenthesis close. The difficulty of assessment, though undoubtedly very great, is of a kind to be diminished rapidly by experience. The first 1,000 such assessments might probably give more trouble, and yet be less accurately made than the next 20,000. End of Appendix G.